A Korean War frostbite survivor lost all his toes, then walked back to the front line on stumps because no one would relieve his squad, and I keep thinking about that old ghost whenever I look down at my own boots sitting by the back door. It is 2 in the morning, the house is so quiet it hums, and the coffee in this mug is cold enough to taste like the dirt we used to churn up outside of Fallujah. I never understood why he went back, that man from the history books, until I spent 6 months in a place where the only thing keeping you tethered to the sanity of your own skin is the man breathing in the sleeping bag next to you. My name is Miller, and before I ever held a rifle that wasn't a wooden toy, I lived in a town in Ohio where the biggest worry we had was whether the high school team would make the state playoffs, and if the diner on Main would ever fix their neon sign that flickered like a dying firefly. I remember the smell of that town, damp autumn leaves, the grease from the deep fryer, and the specific metallic scent of the heavy rain we used to get in October. I was 17, wearing a varsity jacket that felt too big for my shoulders, thinking the world ended at the county line and that my future was a straight, paved road leading to the auto plant where my old man spent 30 years losing his hearing. My girl was Sarah. She had this way of tucking her hair behind her ear when she laughed, a little nervous tick that made me feel like I was the only person on the planet. We spent our Friday nights parked by the reservoir, listening to whatever was on the radio and talking about the day we'd leave. We were going to get an apartment in Columbus, maybe get a dog, maybe just disappear into the kind of normal that felt like a secret. I believed in that future with the kind of blind, arrogant certainty that only kids have. I thought the world was a fair place, mostly because I'd never seen a corner of it that wasn't. I thought if you worked hard, you got paid. If you were a good person, you stayed safe. I thought war was something that happened in grainy black and white footage in the library, something settled by old men in suits who probably never held a weapon in their lives. Then came that Tuesday in late August. It wasn't cinematic. There was no thunderclap, no grand realization. I was sitting at the kitchen table, watching my dad read the paper, the sun hitting the linoleum in a way that made the room look like it was underwater. I realized suddenly and with a terrifying, hollow clarity that if I stayed, I would eventually become him. Not because he was a bad man, but because the gravity of that town was too strong. I needed to see something else. I wanted to see if I was made of anything real, or if I was just a collection of habits I'd inherited from the people around me. I walked into the recruiting office because the door was open, and the sergeant inside had a handshake that made my knuckles ache. He didn't promise me glory. He just looked at my registration papers, looked at my face, and asked me if I was ready to stop playing around. I lied and said yes. I didn't know then that the kid who walked through that door wasn't ever going to be allowed to fully come home again. Boot camp was a blur of dust and shouting, the kind of organized chaos that strips the ego down to the frame. I met Miller, not me, but the other Miller, a kid from Kentucky who could fix anything with a piece of gum and a prayer. We became brothers in the way that happens when you're forced to crawl through mud together until you can't tell your own sweat from the man next to you. We joked about the food, the drill instructors who acted like they were possessed by the ghosts of dead sergeants, and the absurdity of our own existence. We laughed until our ribs ached, a sharp, jagged kind of humor that kept us from looking too closely at the abyss. I remember one night, huddled in the barracks after lights out, talking about what we wanted to eat back in the States. He wanted a steak rare, with so much salt it'd make your heart stop. I just wanted a cold beer on a porch where the only sound was the crickets. We talked about it like it was a promise. We didn't know it was a prayer. When we landed in the desert, the heat hit us like a physical blow, a wall of furnace air that smelled of ancient dust and burning rubber. The landscape was brutal, endless shades of beige, rock, and heat-shimmered horizon that made your eyes ache. We were at an FOB that was basically a collection of shipping containers and sandbags surrounded by nothingness. The routine was our lifeline. Wake up, check your kit, check your weapon, pray the radio stayed clear, and head out on patrol. You'd think the waiting would be the worst part, but it wasn't. The worst part was the sudden, jagged shift from silence to chaos. You could go 6 days of patrolling nothing but empty roads and crumbling concrete walls, your body tense enough to snap, and then, in the blink of an eye, the world would erupt into a series of flashes and thundering roars that turned everything you knew into a nightmare. I remember the first time I heard the snap of a round passing close. It doesn't sound like the move is. It sounds like a whip cracking right against your ear, a sharp, tearing sound that makes your brain freeze before your body knows what to do. You don't have time to be scared in those 4 seconds. You just have time to move. My hands would do things, reload, check my perimeter, drag someone into cover, while my mind was still somewhere else, wondering if Sarah had gotten my last letter, or if the light in the kitchen back home was still hitting the table the same way. It was a strange dissociation that kept me functioning. I wasn't there. I was a spectator in my own body, watching a machine do the work so the man inside could try to stay quiet. We had this guy, Henderson, who played the harmonica. He'd sit on a stack of ammo crates, the desert night so vast and dark above us that you could see every star in the galaxy, and he'd play these soft, mournful blues that felt like they were pulling the sadness out of our bones. We'd sit there in the dark, smoking cigarettes, not saying a word, just listening. In those moments, I felt a kind of love for these men that I still can't put into words. It wasn't the kind of love you have for a family member or a friend back home. It was deeper, more primal. It was the love of someone who knows exactly what your fear tastes like because they've tasted it too. We were all carrying the same weight, and we were all pretending we weren't, and that shared lie made us stronger than anything else could. I wrote to Sarah every week. I never told her about the fear, or the blood, or the way the silence felt heavy with the promise of violence. I told her about the stars. I told her about the heat. I told her I was coming home, and that when I did, we were going to drive until we hit the ocean and just stay there until the memory of this place faded. I believed it. I clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. I remember opening a letter from her, the paper soft and smelling slightly of her perfume, and for 10 minutes I wasn't in a war zone. I was back on that porch. I was 19. I was safe. Then the radio crackled, the sergeant called for a head count, and the reality of where I was folded back over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The missions started getting longer. We were pushed further out, into villages that felt like they hadn't changed in 1,000 years, where the eyes of the people watched us from behind shuttered windows with a mix of indifference and something sharper, something that felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. We didn't talk about it. We just walked, our boots heavy with the grit of the desert, our eyes scanning every shadow, every loose stone, every bend in the road. I felt the tension building in my chest, a tight, cold knot that never quite untied. I'd catch Miller looking at me sometimes, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out, and he'd give me a tiny, tight nod, and I'd know he was feeling the same thing. We were being pushed towards something. We could feel it in the way the air would turn suddenly still, the way the birds would stop singing, the way the silence became so loud it made your head ring. One afternoon, we were hunkered down in the remains of a schoolhouse, the walls pockmarked with bullet holes and the floor covered in broken glass. It was quiet, too quiet. Henderson hadn't played his harmonica in 3 days. We were all just sitting, leaning against the walls, waiting for the order to move out. I looked at the gear piled in the corner, helmets, vests, rifles, and it looked like the discarded skin of a giant, dying insect. I started thinking about that old man who lost his toes but went back to the front. At the time, I thought it was insane. I thought it was the most useless, tragic thing I'd ever heard. Why go back to a place that took everything from you? Why walk on stumps into a meat grinder when you've already paid your debt? I was sitting there, nursing a warm canteen, wondering if I'd have the courage to walk away if I ever got the chance, or if I was already too far gone, too bound to the others, to ever leave them behind. I looked at the doorway where the sun was cutting a sharp, blinding line across the floor. Someone moved in the light. It was our lieutenant, his face grim, his boots covered in a fine layer of gray dust. He didn't look at us. He just looked at the map in his hands, his fingers tracing a line that I knew led to a road we'd been avoiding for weeks. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, a silhouette against the blinding, indifferent desert sun, and I felt my pulse kick up a notch. The silence stretched out, thin and brittle, and I realized that whatever was about to happen, there was no going back from it. We were committed. We were already ghosts, just waiting for the world to catch up to the fact. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. The lieutenant looked up then, his eyes finding mine, and he opened his mouth to give the order. I held my breath, the world narrowing down to that one moment, to the sound of his voice, to the crushing, absolute certainty that everything was about to change forever. The lieutenant didn't talk about glory. He didn't talk about the tactical necessity of the objective or the morale of the battalion. He just said we were pulling point on a route that had been cold for 3 days, and he said it with the kind of tired, flat inflection that let us all know he didn't expect us to find anything but trouble. I looked at Henderson, who was cleaning his harmonica with the corner of his rag, his hands moving with the precision of a man who had no intention of letting the music stop, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not fear exactly, but a deep, quiet recognition. He knew, just like I knew, that the quiet wasn't a sign of peace. It was a held breath. We packed our kit, the familiar grounding weight of the ceramic plates and the extra mags feeling like a second skin, and we stepped out into the furnace heat of the afternoon. The air smelled of salt and dried earth, that metallic, alkaline scent that clings to your sinuses and never truly leaves, no matter how many times you scrub your face in the shower back home. We moved in a staggered file, boots crunching softly on the sun-baked gravel, the world reduced to the back of the neck in front of you and the sliver of horizon you were assigned to watch. There is a specific kind of loneliness in a patrol, even when you are surrounded by men you would die for. You are inside your own head, running a silent reel of everything you've left behind, and the contrast between the reality of the desert and the memories of a suburban Ohio kitchen creates a friction that burns. I kept thinking about the way Sarah's kitchen smelled when she was baking, cinnamon and butter, and I tried to force my brain to inhabit that space, to feel the warmth of the oven instead of the searing, relentless sun. But the desert had a way of reclaiming your focus. Every shadow was a threat, every rock a potential hiding spot, and your body reacted to the stimuli before your intellect could even process the image. My trigger finger was just a ghost, hovering over the guard, a reflex built by months of repetition that had nothing to do with will and everything to do with muscle memory. Miller was trailing me by a few yards, his radio handset pressed to his ear, his jaw set in a line of permanent, gritted tension. He was the one who had kept us sane during the long, monotonous stretches at the FOB, the one who would start a debate about the best pizza in the tri-state area just to hear a human voice that didn't sound like a command. He looked over at me, and for a split second, he grinned, a genuine, lopsided thing that made him look like the kid he'd been back in Kentucky before he'd learned how to properly field strip a rifle in the dark. It was the kind of smile that made you feel human, a reminder that we were people, not just conduits for kinetic energy, but the smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared, wiped away by a sudden, sharp change in the wind. The silence that had been hanging over the valley for miles suddenly snapped. It wasn't a noise, really. It was the absence of the natural hum of the world. The insects stopped. The wind died. The very air seemed to thicken, turning into a heavy, suffocating medium that we were forced to wade through. We hit the junction near the dried-out canal bed, the place where the road narrowed into a throat of shattered concrete and rusted rebar. I remember the way the light hit a piece of scrap metal near the bank, a glint of blue, incongruous and bright, and for a second I thought it was a toy, something a kid had left behind. That split second of curiosity was the luxury I couldn't afford. My training kicked in, a cold, clinical surge of adrenaline that bypassed my stomach and went straight to my hands. I moved to the right, sweeping my rifle across the debris, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that sounded like a war drum. Henderson was covering the left, his harmonica now stowed, his face masked in that familiar, unreadable calm. We were a machine, 6 men synchronized by the terrifying, inevitable knowledge that the center of the world was about to collapse. Then the ground surged. It didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like the earth itself had decided to reject us. The concussion hit my chest like a sledgehammer, a physical bruising wave that knocked the breath right out of my lungs, and for an instant I was suspended in a vacuum where sound had no meaning. The world turned to fire and gray dust, a churning, chaotic wall of debris that obscured the sky and turned the sun into a smear of yellow light. I remember the smell, not of burning rubber or fuel, but of something sharper, a chemical, acrid bite that seared my throat. I was on the ground, my face pressed into the grit, the taste of blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched, insistent whine that drowned out the shouting, but I could feel the vibration of the earth through my boots. I moved. I didn't think, I just moved. I rolled, came up on one knee, and leveled my weapon at the wall of smoke. Miller was down. That was the first thing I saw when the dust began to settle, a ragged, surreal tableau in the center of the road. He wasn't moving. He was just lying there, his kit torn, his rifle lying a few feet away, and the absurdity of it hit me with more force than the blast. He had been talking about pizza 3 minutes ago. He had been planning the crust thickness and the extra cheese, and now he was just a figure in the dirt, a man disconnected from the air he was supposed to be breathing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a cold, crystalline anger wash over me, a sensation so sharp it made my vision blur. I scrambled toward him, my boots slipping on the loose shale, the world around us still erupting in the sporadic, rhythmic popping of fire, but I was focused only on the patch of color that was his uniform. Henderson was already there, his face streaked with dust, his hands hovering over Miller's chest, trying to find a rhythm that wasn't there. We were under fire, but the sound seemed to come from miles away, a background noise that had nothing to do with the center of my universe. I dropped to my knees beside Miller, the heat of the road radiating through my pants, and I reached out to touch his shoulder. It felt wrong. It felt like touching a mannequin, like the life had been drained out of him and left only the husk. I looked at Henderson and he shook his head once, a slow, devastating movement that said everything that needed to be said. We didn't exchange words. There were no grand declarations, no final goodbyes. We just sat there in the middle of a war zone while the world tore itself apart around us, and for the first time I understood the old man with the frozen stumps. I understood why you don't walk away. You don't walk away because the guilt of surviving is a weight that never leaves you, and you don't walk away because once you've seen the truth of what we are capable of, you can never go back to the version of yourself that thought the world was a fair place. The lieutenant was shouting orders, his voice raw, and I could hear the others moving, shifting positions, pouring fire into the tree line, but the sound was detached, a film playing on a screen I was no longer watching. I kept my hand on Miller's shoulder, a desperate, irrational tether, trying to pull him back from the edge, trying to make the math of the situation change. I was thinking about the letter he'd kept in his pocket, the one from his sister that he read every time we got a mail drop, and I wondered if she knew. I wondered if the world back in Kentucky had stopped, if the sky had turned that same shade of gray, if the people who didn't know how to spell our names were going about their day, drinking coffee and talking about the weather, completely unaware that the sun had set on a piece of their lives. The horror wasn't in the violence. The horror was in the realization that we were so small, so easily erased, and that the world had no intention of slowing down for us. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, and I picked up my rifle. I didn't feel like a soldier. I felt like a ghost, a remnant of a man who had died in the dust a few minutes ago. I moved to the perimeter, the firing now coming from all sides, a chaotic, blinding, desperate mess of muzzle flashes in the gathering dusk. I fired at the flashes, my movements automated, my brain still trapped in the stillness of the road where Miller lay. I remember seeing a shadow move behind a crumbling stone wall, a silhouette in the twilight, and I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger, a rhythmic, mechanical action, watching the shadow collapse. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I felt only a deeper, darker exhaustion, a fatigue that seemed to sink into my marrow and anchor me to the spot. The engagement went on for an hour or maybe 10 minutes. Time had lost its currency. It was just an endless sequence of flashes, heat, and the sharp, snapping sound of lead passing through the air. When the firing finally died down, the silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. We were all huddled behind the remaining wall of a mud brick structure, our chests heaving, our faces masks of dust and dried blood. Nobody spoke. We didn't look at each other. We just sat there in the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the pockmarked ruins, the sound like a long, mournful sigh. Henderson was sitting against a pillar, his eyes fixed on the ground, his fingers tracing the shape of his harmonica in his pocket, but he didn't pull it out. He couldn't. I sat a few feet away, my eyes locked on the horizon, watching the first stars begin to bleed through the black. I was thinking about Ohio, about the flickering neon sign of the diner, and I realized with a sick, sinking feeling that I couldn't see it anymore. I couldn't remember the exact shade of the paint on my front door. I couldn't remember the sound of Sarah's laugh. They had been overwritten. The radio buzzed, a static-filled voice calling for a status report, and the lieutenant picked it up, his voice cracking as he gave the coordinates. He didn't mention Miller. He just gave the numbers, a cold, military inventory of what was left, and the voice on the other end answered with the same hollow efficiency. We were still there. We were still alive. That was the only report that mattered, the only truth that held any weight. I looked down at my boots, the leather scuffed and stained with the red, iron-heavy dirt of the region, and I saw a smudge of something dark on the toe. I didn't wipe it off. I just stared at it, the irony of it blooming in my chest like a dark flower. I had wanted to know if I was made of anything real, and here I was, covered in the reality of the earth, stained by the life that had been pulled out of the man who had been my brother. The night deepened, the cold of the desert creeping in, sharp and biting against our skin. We huddled together for warmth, a ragged, shivering mass of bodies, not saying a word, each of us locked inside the prison of our own thoughts. I could feel Miller's absence as a physical presence, a hole in the formation that no amount of positioning could fill. He was the one who was supposed to be checking the perimeter, the one who was supposed to be cracking a joke about the MREs before we tried to sleep. I found myself listening for his voice, for the rasp of his breathing, for the sound of his boots on the stone, but there was only the wind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled, dust-covered photo I'd been keeping, the one of me and Sarah by the reservoir, and I looked at it in the dim, ghost light of the moon. Her face looked like a stranger's. She was a ghost from a life I'd left on another planet, a creature of light and air who had nothing to do with the man sitting in the dirt with blood under his fingernails. I put the photo away, the paper fragile and brittle in my hand, and I closed my eyes, but the darkness was worse. Behind my lids, the scene on the road kept playing on a loop, the flash, the dust, the way Miller had looked in the dirt. It was etched into my brain, a permanent, high-definition recording that I couldn't stop, couldn't pause, couldn't delete. I tried to think of anything else. The sound of the rain back in Ohio, the smell of the auto plant, the feeling of a cold beer on a Friday night, but those memories had lost their color. They were monochrome, fading, losing their reality to the vivid, terrifying brightness of the here and now. The war wasn't a place you visited. It was a place that moved into your house and took over, rearranging the furniture and changing the locks until you couldn't find your way back to the rooms where you used to live. A flare went up, a blinding, magnesium-white light that turned the desert into a stage, and we all instinctively pressed our faces into the grit, our hands moving to our rifles, our muscles coiled and ready to fight a war that had already claimed its price. The light lingered for what felt like an eternity, washing over the ruins, over the blood, over the stillness, and for a heartbeat, I saw the face of every man in the unit, illuminated by that cruel, artificial sun. They looked like me. They looked like they had been hollowed out, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on things that weren't there. We weren't men anymore, we were machines of bone and trauma, moving in a rhythm set by the violence. The flare died, and the darkness rushed back in, heavy and absolute, and I felt a sense of relief so profound it almost made me weep. In the dark, at least, I didn't have to see. Henderson leaned over then, his shoulder brushing mine, a silent, fragile gesture of brotherhood that almost shattered me. He didn't speak, but I could feel the tremor in his body, the way his breath hitched, the way he was holding onto the same fraying threads of reality that I was. I leaned back into him, taking the contact like a lifeline, and for a long moment we just sat there, two men anchored to the earth by the weight of what we had seen. I knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes in the darkest hours, that this was the end of the beginning. We were going to keep moving, we were going to keep patrolling, we were going to keep breathing until the air ran out or the sun stopped rising. But the version of us that had started this, the version that had walked into that recruitment office, was already gone. It had been left on the road, somewhere between the shattered concrete and the smell of the iron, and it wasn't coming back. The radio crackled again, a directive to shift position, and the lieutenant was standing, his silhouette tall and jagged against the stars. We followed one by one, like ghosts being led through the ruins of a city that had never known a name. My boots felt heavier than before, the sand inside them grinding against my skin, but I didn't care. I moved with a mechanical, relentless pace, my eyes scanning the darkness, my rifle held at the ready, my body operating on a level of awareness that was purely instinct. We didn't look back. We didn't whisper about Miller. We didn't talk about the heat or the war or the future. We just walked, our shadows stretching out long and thin behind us, disappearing into the vast, indifferent desert that had already seen 1,000 armies come and go. I looked up at the stars, the same stars I'd told Sarah about in my letters, and I realized they were just cold, distant balls of gas, uncaring of the mess we'd made down here. They didn't offer comfort. They didn't offer guidance. They just burned, distant and bright and final, and I understood then that we were on our own. There was no grand design, no higher meaning to the suffering, just the reality of the ground beneath us and the men beside us. I felt the weight of my gear, the sharpness of the air, the dull throb in my jaw, and I accepted it all as the price of admission. I was here, I was still standing. That was the only fact that held any truth. We were heading toward the extraction point, the horizon beginning to lighten with the bruised purple of the pre-dawn, and I felt a strange, detached curiosity about what would happen when we finally reached the perimeter. Would I still be me? Or would I be a reflection of the man I had been, a hollowed-out imitation moving through the motions of a life I could no longer inhabit? We reached the edge of the ridge, the valley spread out before us like a map of everything we had lost, and the lieutenant stopped. He turned to look at us, his face a mask of exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the pale, early light of the morning. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a small, final gesture, and we all sat down, the fatigue finally catching up to us, dragging us into the dirt. I leaned my head back against a rock, the stone cold and hard against my skull, and I watched the sky begin to transition from black to gray. I was waiting for something, a sign, a feeling, a change, but there was only the silence. I looked over at Henderson, who was sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic motion that I didn't dare interrupt. I looked at the others, each of them a monument to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute, crushing reality. I thought about the word home, and it felt like a foreign language, a word that had lost its meaning through overusage. Was there a home left for us? Or had we changed so fundamentally that the world we had left was now as alien as this desert? I couldn't answer. I didn't want to. I just wanted the sun to finish rising. I wanted the heat to come back and burn the dampness from my bones, and I wanted to be able to move again. The uncertainty of it was the only thing that kept me breathing, the only thing that gave me a reason to wake up the next day. I realized in that moment of absolute, bone-deep weariness that I wasn't waiting for the war to end. I was waiting for the version of myself that could exist in a world that wasn't this one. The lieutenant began to pack his gear, his movements slow and deliberate, and we followed suit, the familiar ritual of checking the clips, tightening the straps, and securing the pouches, providing a necessary grounding structure. We were doing it again. We were going to stand up, we were going to walk out into the desert, and we were going to pretend that we hadn't just lost a piece of our souls on that road. It was the ultimate necessary lie. We weren't fighting for land or for country or for anything as abstract as a victory. We were fighting for the man to our left and the man to our right, for the shared knowledge of the abyss, and for the simple, terrifying fact that we had nothing else. We were, all of us, living in the space between heartbeats, and as long as the pulse kept going, we were going to keep going with it. I stood up, the movement causing a spike of pain in my knee, and I adjusted my rifle. I didn't look at the road we had come from. I didn't look for Miller. I looked toward the extraction point, toward the hum of the engines that I could just barely hear in the distance, a low, vibration-heavy sound that promised a temporary, uneasy safety. I felt the weight of the rifle, the familiar pressure of the pack, the cold grit of the desert in my lungs, and I walked forward. The world kept moving, the sun continued to rise, and I was still standing, moving through the light like a specter, carrying the weight of everything I had seen and everything I had become, a man who had left his future in the dust, and was now, for the first time, truly beginning to understand the cost of the ground he stood on. I didn't look back. I just walked, the cadence of my boots in the sand the only sound in a world that had gone quiet, waiting for the next shift, the next movement, the next impossible, shattering moment to arrive. I was still here. That was the only thing I knew for certain, and for now it was enough. The engine noise grew louder, a mechanical, rhythmic growl that promised an exit, a plane, a different kind of sky, and I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the horizon, my heart beating a slow, steady, resilient rhythm in the silence of the dawn. The nightmare wasn't over, it was just waiting for the next act, and I was finally ready to play my part. I could feel the wind shifting, a change in the air that signaled the arrival of the transport, and I didn't slow down. I walked toward the noise, toward the dust, toward the life that was waiting for me on the other side of the fire, not knowing what I would find, only knowing that I was walking, and that was the only thing that mattered. The transport was coming into view, a dark shape against the brightening sky, and I felt a surge of something that might have been hope, or might have been the final, desperate gasp of a man who had already seen everything. I kept walking. The roar of the engines took over the world, washing out the silence, the wind, the memory of the road, and I letting the sound consume me, let it be the only thing in the universe, a roar of pure kinetic energy that pushed me forward, one step after another into the light. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to reach the gate. I had to reach the plane. I had to see if I was still whole, if there was anything left of the man who had walked through that recruiting office on that Tuesday in August. The dust was rising, a thick yellow shroud that swallowed the landscape, and I moved through it, a ghost in the machine, propelled by the simple, terrifying force of the necessity to keep going, to keep standing, to keep existing in a world that had tried its hardest to turn me into a memory. I reached the ramp, the steel cold and vibrating under my boots, and I looked up at the sky, one last look at the desert that had claimed so much, one last look at the place where I had learned the true, brutal, beautiful nature of what it meant to survive. I stepped onto the ramp, the interior of the plane dark and humming, and I felt the transition, the shift from the world of the dead to the world of the waiting. The ramp began to rise, the desert closing off, the light fading into a narrow, receding strip of color, and I sat down, my rifle between my knees, my head leaning back against the metal wall, and I closed my eyes. The roar was deafening, a wall of sound that blocked out every thought, every memory, every ghost, and I let it happen, letting the vibration shake the last of the dust from my clothes, from my skin, from my mind. I was alive. I was going home, and I was, in every way that mattered, someone else entirely. The plane tilted, the acceleration pushing me back into the seat, and I felt the shift in gravity, the lift, the move away from the earth, and for the first time in an eternity, I didn't look down. I looked up at the dark, narrow space of the cabin, at the faces of the men beside me, at the reality of the present, and I let the past fall away, drop by agonizing drop, until there was nothing left but the rhythm of the engines, the steady, driving, relentless hum of a machine that was taking me toward a future I could no longer recognize, a future that was waiting for me on the other side of the world, a future that I was finally, after everything, going to have to learn how to live in. The engines roared, a massive, all-encompassing sound that drowned out everything, and I held onto the seat, my fingers white-knuckled, my breath steady, my heart pumping a slow, rhythmic, defiant cadence that echoed the power of the machine, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated survival, a rhythm that was going to carry me, finally, out of the dark. I was still there, sitting in the vibration, and I was going to stay there, in the movement, in the journey, in the. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the dust had looked, the way it had settled, the way it had covered everything, and I wondered if it was still settling, if it was still falling, if the desert was still breathing, and I decided in the final, quiet moment before the plane hit the cruising altitude that I would never know, and that was okay. I was going somewhere else. I was moving. And that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever been true. The roar settled into a steady, pulsing thrum, and I felt the weight of the air, the pressure of the altitude, the shift in the very fabric of my existence, and I knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes at the end of a long, impossible journey, that I was finally going to be able to close my eyes. And I did. I closed them, and for the first time in 6 months, I didn't see the road. I didn't see the dust. I didn't see the flash. I just felt the movement, the forward, steady, relentless movement toward a horizon that was finally, beginning to turn into a sunrise. I was going home. I was going back to the life I had left, but I was going as a stranger, a traveler who had seen the edges of the world and was now, for the first time, going to have to find his way back to the center. I was still there. I was still me, and I was going to make it. The plane hummed a song of iron and fire, and I let the sound take me, letting it pull me into a sleep that felt, for the first time, like it might actually be deep enough to last. I was still standing. I was still here, and I was ready to see what happened next. The flight home felt like a long, slow transition between two different lives. We were all packed into that metal tube like cargo, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the faint, lingering scent of jet fuel that seemed to seep into our very clothes. I stared at the back of the seat in front of me for 10 hours, listening to the drone of the engines, that constant, grinding vibration that rattled my teeth and made every muscle in my body ache. I kept waiting for the panic to hit, the part where I realized I was leaving behind the only version of reality that made sense anymore, but it never came. Instead, there was just this hollow, expansive silence inside my chest. I had a letter from Sarah tucked into my pocket, the ink slightly blurred from the humidity of the desert, but I didn't take it out. I wasn't ready to bridge the gap yet. I wasn't ready to try and read the words of a woman who didn't know the man sitting in row 42. When we landed at the base in California, the tarmac hit us with a heat that felt wrong. It was too clean. The air didn't smell of salt or rot. It smelled of pavement and distance. We walked off that plane with our duffels slung over our shoulders, blinking in the bright, unfiltered sunlight like creatures dragged up from the deep. There were people there, civilians in comfortable clothes, walking around with coffees and cell phones, and the sight of them made me feel like I was watching a documentary about a civilization that had been dead for centuries. I saw a man in a polo shirt laughing at something his daughter said, and the sound of it hit me with such force that I had to look at my own boots to keep from swaying. I was still wearing the same grime from the road, the same red dust in the creases of my skin, and standing next to them, I felt like a bruise on the landscape. My sister met me at the airport 2 days later. She looked exactly like I remembered, the same nervous way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was trying to hide how scared she was, but her face was younger than I expected. She hugged me and I felt the smallness of her, the fragility of a life that had never been touched by the things I'd carried across the ocean. I held onto her for a second too long, my arms stiff, my jaw tight, trying to force myself to feel the warmth of home, but all I could focus on was the exit sign behind her head. I was counting the ways out. It was a habit now, a glitch in my wiring. I didn't want to be there, but I didn't know where else to go, so I just let her lead me to the car and watched the American suburbs roll by like a movie I'd seen a dozen times but couldn't understand. The first night in my old bedroom was the hardest. The house was too quiet. The silence wasn't the hollow, threatening silence of the desert. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that filled every corner of the room. I lay in the dark with my eyes wide open, listening to the refrigerator hum and the wind rattle the leaves against the window, and every sound felt like a potential threat. I was waiting for the snap, for the vibration of the ground, for the flash of light that would tell me it was time to move, but there was nothing. I sat up at 3 in the morning and walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cold under my bare feet, and I opened the pantry. The smell of boxed cereal and canned soup hit me, a domestic, mundane scent that should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel like I was suffocating. I sat at the table and stared at the clock, watching the second-hand tick, realizing that I had become a ghost in my own house, haunting a space where the man who lived there didn't exist anymore. Months turned into a year, and the world began to settle into a new, jagged shape. I got a job at the distribution center, hauling crates, the physical labor the only thing that felt honest. It kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering into the places I wasn't allowed to go. There were moments of joy, small, sharp flashes of it. The taste of an ice-cold beer on a Saturday afternoon, the way the sun felt on my face when I finally walked out of the warehouse after a double shift, the simple, quiet pride of being able to pay my own bills. I'd sit on the porch and watch the cars go by, and sometimes for a split second, I'd think about Henderson and feel a sudden, crushing wave of gratitude for the life I'd managed to drag back with me. But then I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the glass door, my eyes looking different, older, fixed on the horizon, and the joy would evaporate, replaced by a dull, aching guilt. I was still here, and they weren't. That was the math I couldn't solve. I tried the VA, sitting in those beige rooms with the fluorescent lights that buzzed with a sound that made my skin crawl. The counselor was a man who'd never been, someone who read about the war in books and asked me questions about my childhood that felt like an insult to the reality of the road. I told him about the dust. I told him about the way the earth moved. I told him about Miller. He'd write things on his notepad and nod with that practiced, pitying expression, and I'd leave the office feeling like I'd been hollowed out all over again. I stopped going after the third time. I didn't need someone to explain the trauma. I needed to know how to live with it. I found my own way. I started running at night, miles and miles of empty, dark streets, letting the physical exhaustion burn away the noise in my head. It was the only time I could breathe. It was the only time the ghost of the desert didn't feel like it was sitting on my chest. Then there was the dinner with Sarah. It was a year after I'd been back. We met at the diner where we'd spent our last night before I left, the same vinyl booth, the same smell of burnt coffee and grease. She was talking about her life, about the promotion she'd gotten and the move she was planning, and she looked so happy, so vibrant and unburdened, that I felt a sudden, sharp ache of love for her that was almost too big to hold. I reached out to touch her hand, and my fingers hovered just above the table, trembling. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her about the canal bed and the blue scrap of metal and the way the world had turned to fire. But I looked at her, at the brightness in her eyes, and I knew I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't drag her into the dark. I pulled my hand back, made a joke about the coffee being just as bad as I remembered, and we both laughed, but I felt the distance between us like a physical wall. We were two different species now, and I knew with a final, crushing clarity that I was never going to be able to make her understand. I'm standing on my front porch now, watching the sun set over the street. The sky is turning that specific, bruised purple that reminds me of the ridge, but it doesn't scare me anymore. It's just the sky. I still check the exits when I walk into a restaurant, and I still sleep with a light on in the hallway, and I still have days where the weight of it all is so heavy I can barely stand to move. But there are other days too, days where I wake up and the air feels clean, and I can hear the birds in the trees, and I can feel the life in my own hands. I've learned that the damage isn't something you get over. It's something you carry, like a scar that changes the way you move, but eventually stops hurting every time you touch it. I still have hope. It's smaller now, more specific, more fragile, but it's there. I hope I can sleep without the lights on one day. I hope I can tell Sarah the truth, or maybe just find someone who doesn't need to hear it. I hope I can just be here, completely and entirely, without looking over my shoulder for a shadow that isn't coming. My neighbor is out on his lawn, tinkering with his lawnmower, the engine sputtering and coughing in the twilight. He waves at me, a casual, friendly gesture, and I wave back, feeling the solid, familiar weight of the world under my feet. I'm not the same man who left for the desert, and I never will be. I've seen the edges, and I know what's waiting in the dark, but I've also seen the light that comes after, the way the sun rises even when you're sure it never will again. I'm still standing. I'm still trying, and that has to be enough. I reach into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the dog tags I haven't worn in years, and I take a long, slow breath of the cool, evening air. It's a good night. The world is quiet. I think I'll go inside, make a cup of coffee, and watch the stars come out, one by one, until the night is finally, perfectly still. The road doesn't end where you think it does.